Thank you. I'm so glad everybody came. I hope that you enjoy the program tonight. I'm sure we will. It's about the Green Line bus. And we all remember seeing the Green Line bus come out to Dixie and turn around there in front of St. Paul's School. The author, or one of the authors, there are two, Terry William Lehmann. He grew up in Newport, and he also went to Southern California for a brief while. And then during the 40s and the 50s, he had about 11 relatives, some close, some distant, who actually worked for the Green Line. And he graduated from Georgetown College in '65 with a BA degree. And then he went on, and this is admirable, he went on to Chase School of Law, which was then in Cincinnati, and got his Juris Doctor. And that was in '72. And then he started worked for Procter & Gamble for a while, AK Steel, and Connecticut General Life. And then since 1975, he's been an assistant United States attorney for the Southern District of Ohio. And that's what he still does to this day, right?
Well, I'm retired now.
You are retired now. Oh, okay,
Yeah,
good.
they showed me the door.
Oh. Thank you, Pat.
And you said thank you.
Yeah.
He's a member of the Cincinnati Transit Historical Association, where he had a small part in restoring Cincinnati Curbsider 2435 and the Santa Fe Railway Historical and Modeling Society. You got to talk to my husband, he's into model trains. He also collects Pacific Electric memorabilia. They say he writes a pretty good legal brief, but he's also written a number of articles on public transit, including an article with a two-parter, as he calls it, about the Green Line, and that was published in Motor Coach Age, a magazine for those aficionados. So, without any more ado, let me give you Terry Lehmann.
We're going to put the lights on 50% tan, and that keeps our photographer here happy. You know, I get a little nervous with groups because as a former prosecutor, I was used to speaking to only 12 plus alternates, and there's more people here. This also reminds me a little bit of my Baptist upbringing, in that Baptist churches, at least, people tended to congregate in the back because Baptist ministers tended to go a little longer than my experience now with Presbyterian ministers. My wife got me jumping over to the Scottish Presbyterians, but and then to top it all off, you all passed a basket around. I mean, what more can I say? We're going to talk a little bit, and especially since this is a Boone County crowd, we're going to talk a little bit of how the local transit company played an enormous role in developing what we now know as the Greater Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky International Airport. Although our international part is a little tenuous right now with one flight to Paris and a few to various joints in Mexico. But in any event, I have no ground rules. If you have an observation, a question, or you know I'm dead wrong, on the first two, be sure and interrupt me. On the third, think about it, because I'm sensitive. But no, if you have any observations, you're never 100% correct when you're doing historical research. Either overlook something, or maybe the people have before us that actually made some of these memorandum maybe sort of bent the truth as we went along. Who knows? Anyhow, without further ado, this baby, and we're gonna play here with the focus for just a second. That's pretty good. This is what got Northern Kentucky into the economic mainstream instead of the economic backstream of this conglomeration we call Greater Cincinnati. Although on a whole, boat building, the steamships always pulled in on the Cincinnati side because it was a better channel there, and for no other reason. But with the opening of the rolling suspension bridge in 1867, other than for foot passengers, what opened in December 1866, I know that. Somebody's always say, no, it actually opened in 1866. Notice how different the suspension bridge is today from then. In the 1890s, they added a whole second set of cables and also made this bridge into a semi-truss bridge. And because the bridge in the 1890s was it was attempting to do the mechanical equivalent of a swan dive into the Ohio River. The streetcars, who were electric by 1890, had to crawl over this thing at 3 miles an hour. There was the first electric streetcar in Cincinnati, the old Federal Building, in 1890. This thing went all the way up Madison Avenue to 16th Street, penetrated the far corners of habitable Kenton County at the time, so to speak. By 1900, the Green Line had the Cincinnati, Newport, and Covington Railway and its subsidiary, the South Covington and Cincinnati Street Railway, commonly known as the Green Line because the cars were eventually painted green when they penetrated into Cincinnati to be distinguished from the orange cars of the Cincinnati Street Railway. So it got the nickname the Green Line, and then it actually adopted that name as an advertising thing, and they had the thing registered, the Green Line. But you can see it extended up into Bellevue and Dayton, all the way down through Fort Thomas, all the way through Southgate to the Evergreen Cemetery, and then Ludlow, the Holman Line, the Rosedale Line, the Eastern Avenue Line. The only thing that's missing by 1900 is the line that eventually gets as far as South Fort Mitchell. That would be remedied in the next decade. And this line then came all the way down through Fort Mitchell, Park Hills, and South Fort Mitchell. Of course, now there's a merger, so that also fouls up the historian, because Fort Mitchell and South Fort Mitchell eventually merged. The line until 1910, but for 7 years, only went as far as the cemeteries. And they did enormous business on Saturdays and Sundays because in those days, and I remember being drug along, I guess is the word, to cemeteries that far down in Pendleton County where a lot of the Ravenscrafts were from, the Roanoke Cemetery. My wife and I finally found it. And you know, the road's not wide enough for 2 cars when you get there. Anyhow, by 1910, the railroad was there. The Green Line got these big cars in 1917, and we're going to have to play a little bit with the focus. I think that's is that pretty good? Okay. The line that serviced all the way out to South Fort Mitchell was the 1 line, and it was the busiest line on the entire system. This didn't go out until July 1950. Incidentally, if you're interested in cars, look at that Woody station wagon. We digress. Well, here we are past the cemeteries, where it used to turn on a turntable right here and go back down. This is obviously a late 40s, early 1950 shot, probably late 49 or spring of 50. Cemeteries are still there. They very seldom move them. And of course, it turned around. It's still one of my favorite places to eat.
Yes.
The old Greyhound Really. Now, I had a bunch of relatives, uncles, cousins, what have you, that were motormen. And even as a young kid, very young child, I would go out with them on the one line. They would drop me off and I would have a snack. And they'd go back downtown and pick me up their next run. Incidentally, there was also a shuttle bus here to Crescent Springs. And there's the shuttle bus. There's a fallen flag, pure oil. And up until the service ended, of course, they had a car that you could charter, the Kentucky. It was a parlor car. It had wicker seats and a wicker couch, and you could charter it, and people did up until 1950. That's now at DeVue Park. Now we're going to get closer to the getting into the airport here a little bit. In 1922, a bus line was started called the Dixie Traction by the local Studebaker dealer owners Dempsey and Rouse. And for 3 years, the Dixie Traction went only from the end of the car line at the Greyhound Grill out to Erlanger and Florence. In 1925, they bought these big Studebaker buses. You're a Studebaker dealer, you buy Studebaker buses if you can. And they started going in competition with the Green Line all the way to downtown Cincinnati. This was after Dixie Highway was paved sufficiently that you didn't lose a kidney bumping up and down on the old road. In the 30s, the Dixie Traction Company got these modern buses from Mack Motor Coach and replaced all those old clunkers. In 1940, the Dixie Traction was purchased by the Green Line. Now we get to the airport part of this for a minute. This was the original grandiose plan for Lunken Airport in Cincinnati. Lunken was going to be the airport for the region. Well, you can see that was their terminal in 1930. It didn't actually work out that Cincinnati had a whole lot of interest in developing a major airport. American Airlines did start the first commercial flight from Lunken Airport to Indianapolis and Chicago in December 1927. And a few airlines joined the fray later. But American Airlines at that time had not purchased the Embry-Riddle Company. And there is the first schedule between Cincinnati and Chicago. This is, I think, from the 1928 book. That was their first, a single-engine airplane that it was a Fokker, seated 7 whole people, in addition to carrying the mail. Airlines were heavily subsidized by the government because there was no way that this could be profitable, carrying 7 people in the mail. By 1931, American Airlines became a dominant force. Not only did they fly from Cincinnati to Indianapolis to Chicago, but Cincinnati to Fort Worth, to Atlanta, and New Orleans. And these wonderful 3-engine Ford Trimotors. They were all aluminum. Basically, they seated 12 passengers, and they were noisier than sin. The engines are not cowled. There was no real attempt for soundproofing, but these things were safe because it was an all-metal construction. And I have been up in the cockpit and co-piloted this plane on a number of occasions, one like it, and it has a stall speed of about 70 miles an hour. It's almost impossible. It looked like the thing wouldn't fly, but it was a very stable airplane. By 1935, American Airlines, here's where we are in Cincinnati there, they had extended, pretty much covered the country from New York and Washington, D.C., all the way to Los Angeles and San Diego. I mentioned that because in 1934, there's the Ford Tri-Motor again, the Cincinnati Reds were the first team to charter an airplane when they went up to Wrigley Field one time. But if you'll note, see how you get that, it said in the, but 6 players refused to fly and took the train. Here was Lunken's downfall. 1937, there was a flood of monumental proportions here, as you know. As a matter of fact, this is a picture of downtown Covington. This is the end of the suspension bridge. And you'll notice there's a little build-up causeway here between Pittsburgh and Cairo, Illinois. This was the only motor lifeline between over the Ohio River. And Louisville had it even rougher than we did. They had a lot of fires, and everybody sent fire trucks over the bridge and out and down to Louisville. It also affected Lunken Airport. And Lunken Airport was not only subjected to the big flood here in 37, but they were affected to some extent with smaller floods even. Enter Philip Gosler Vondersmith, the general manager of the Green Line. He was also general manager of the Union Light Heat and Power Company at a very young age. He was in his 30s. Now, Gosler is the name you want to remember because his uncle, Philip Gosler, was on the board of directors of the Columbia Gas and Electric Company, a large conglomerate that controlled, well, among others, Cincinnati Gas and Electric, Union Light Heat and Power, and various other electric companies all across the eastern part of the United States. By virtue of the fact that Union Light Heat and Power wanted, the Green Line produced its own electricity and had some to spare. So they reluctantly bought the Green Line in 1907 as a subsidiary. So until 1944, the Green Line was owned by Union Light Heat and Power, or Cincinnati Gas and Electric, or Columbia Gas and Electric, take your pick. Anyhow, Mr. Vondersmith was also the president of the Kenton County Chamber of Commerce, because the Green Line had both extensive barns to store their cars at 20th and Madison in Covington, and of course at 11th and Brighton in Newport. But at that time, the Green Line headquarters was on Court Street in Covington, that very nice building that actually has been preserved to this day. So anyhow, Vondersmith, who was a graduate of Yale, was back at a reunion in 1939. And he happened to run into one of his old roommates, who happened to be working for the Civil Aeronautics Board. And casually, as they were either sipping a libation, he said, you know, we've been looking at this situation in Lunken, and we're tired of it. Every year, it seems like, we've got to suspend air service to Cincinnati. And he said, you know, there might be some funds available. So Vondersmith came back and talked to some of the local people, and they formed a Kenton County Airport Board.
Because Boone County didn't want it, Judge Crawford didn't want it.
But there was a problem in Kenton County. There was not enough cheap available land. So, well, let's get back a little bit. This is the last time when, that's a Lunken shot. That's a DC-3. That was the first successful commercial airliner. It could carry as many as 24 people on 2 engines, much more streamlined, and it was the first airliner in the world that arguably could pay its own way. and on American, it was called the Flagship. The co-pilot's duty at each time they landed and parked was to put out this little American Airlines flag. Their old rocket for it there. Anyhow, that's Lunken. This is about 1940, 41. Now, Delta came into our area in 1941. So that became airline number 3 to serve Lunken Airport. Number 2 actually was TWA, Trans World Airlines, who had a route from St. Louis to Cincinnati and up to Columbus and Cleveland. Those are only 3. The clouds of war gathered for World War II. Notice this wonderful Clouds of War shot. I actually took that out of, I do that occasionally when I'm flying. It looked like a nice one. Well, let me back up. Don't want to get to that slide yet. I got to tell you a story now. Vondersmith got together with some people, and they were having trouble finding enough land in Kenton County at an available price. So one day, Vondersmith's out trying to find sweet corn in Boone County, and he sees this farm. I believe a majority of the property was owned by the Steinfort family, and they took an option to buy it at $40 an acre to start an airport. Of course, in the meantime, Pearl Harbor happens. Well, you would think that would shut down all possibility of construction of a commercial civil airport. No. Among their friends was Alvin Barkley, senator, and of course Brent Spence, congressman. Both of them had been very loyal to FDR all during the New Deal and never forsaken him? Anyhow, forsook him, or something like that. And as you may know, in the late 30s, we started sliding into another recession, even with the New Deal, and a lot of Democrats sort of became lukewarm supporting Roosevelt, but not Spence and Barkley. They stayed very firm advocates. To make a long story short, in January or February of 1942, FDR signed the authorization to construct an airport on the Boone County site. Now, talk about pool. They also had to go to the Kentucky legislature and get permission so the Kenton County Airport Board would have jurisdiction in yet another county. And that was one of the first times in America a multi-county type of legislation had ever been passed. Again, and then they needed a runway, or they needed a highway to get from Dixie Highway out to the airport site, and the highway commissioner just happened to be a guy by the name of Donaldson, and by Georgia Highway started. In and amongst all the shortages of concrete and steel, it was built during World War II. As a matter of fact, the fiction was it was used as a practice base for B-17 training from Rickenbacker in Columbus. But best of my records, it was only used about 4 times, so it was basically a fiction. But anyhow, the airport got built by the end of the war. Now, you knew that DC-3 wasn't going to make it, so here was some of the, depending on the engineering department, the personnel department, the treasury, some designs for new airplanes. That's a little bit of a joke. Sales, of course, wanted a swimming pool on top of that, theirs. Here's the airport. It's October 1946 configuration. There's your basic, at that time, 3 runways, because planes were still somewhat dependent upon trying to get a wind in their face to help them lift off. So with 3 runways you had about every part of the campus covered. There's the administration building. And on January 10, 1947, American Airlines landed the first plane at at our airport here on this side of the creek, followed by a 918, followed by a Delta Airlines airplane at 922, and the TWA airplane at 938. The Green Line also made a deal with the Kenton County Airport Board. They would provide, in exchange for providing exclusive service to the airport from the downtown hotels, and also exclusive taxi service from the airport to various points in northern Kentucky and southern Ohio, they would pay the airport board 3 cents for the first 4,000 people carried a year, 4 cents for the next 4,000, and on a sliding scale. There's the Delta airplane coming in a few minutes after the American Airlines plane, and there's the TWA plane. And there is the Greater Cincinnati Airport and part of this building is actually still hidden, or was hidden for many years, within the late departed Terminal 1. Meanwhile, the Dixie Traction got some new buses in 1946, and that's their new bus on the right, much more streamlined and modern. They lined up their old buses, and you could actually not only, they had public transit, not only just from the hotels, but sometimes the Route 1 would branch off and serve the airport about 4 or 5 times a day for the workers. That went away in the early 50s and didn't come back until Tank. And Mark Donahue, the very aggressive general manager at the time, instituted the new Route 2X directly to the airport. The first 4-engine airplane arrived a little later in 1947. This is a Delta DC-4. And this thing went from Chicago to Cincinnati, to Atlanta, to Jacksonville, to Miami. The Southern Railroad took about 25 hours. They took about 7 hours. And the Delta, but this airplane was not pressurized. That was still a problem. They still had to fly it pretty low. And they were the first of the 4 Dixie Traction airporters to take people to and from the hotels in Cincinnati and back under wing. This was the extent, ICC map, of the airport being right down there, the extent of service that Dixie Traction, owned by the Green Line, the red top cabs could cover in the various zones. So they pretty well had a monopoly in the area. In 1948, Piedmont Airlines extended a route to Cincinnati, still using DC-3s. As a matter of fact, if you remember from the American Airlines one's a lightning stripe, this is obviously a used American. They didn't even bother to change the lightning stripe. They just put in Piedmont instead of American on the airlines, and they were in business. Now, this was a replacement for the DC-3. This is a Convair 240. This airplane was pressurized. That was an important thing for air travelers because you could sometimes get up above the bad weather. And no matter how high the plane went, it was always theoretically supposed to be at about the pressure of Mexico City, 7,500 feet. There are 3 of the first red top cab type limousines. I always call them DeSotos. Someone that was an aficionado actually says they're Dodges.
I thought they were a Plymouth by the girl because they had one sitting down the creek and
Aha! Another Chrysler Corporation. You may be right. I never got cars right, but there's the airport or bus.
There's not much difference in them.
There's some more of them as business grew rapidly. The airport, there's a better look. See, they always had and in the back here on our last window, that whole area was for baggage. They had a lot of capacity to carry baggage, because you see pictures, especially of women traveling in the early 50s. They had their white gloves and heels and baggage, you know, for every occasion. Now, of course, we don't do that, even us of more mature years, because there ain't anybody left to carry the stuff except us. I hear an amen out there, yeah. It's getting more like church all the time. Lake Central Airlines came into Cincinnati in 1950, into Greater Cincinnati, Northern Kentucky Airport. Lunken's done as of 1947 as a commercial field. And there's TWA. They replaced their DC-3s with an equivalent airplane. This is a Martin 404. That's almost like a Convair. It was also pressurized, very fast, 350 miles an hour. And here's a red top cab limousine, and there's some promotion here. You car for hire, taxi rates. Oh, that was good or bad, anyhow. That is a Pontiac. There's a couple of red top cabs out in front of the administration building circa 1955. Delta upgraded their stuff. There's another Convair 340 or 440, I can't tell the difference. Piedmont upgraded with some Martin 404s. Then Delta was first on the block with the DC-6. This was a 4-engine pressurized airplane. This could get you non-stop from Cincinnati to Miami in 4 hours. And that was actually the quantum leap here, and that pretty well dried up the first-class Pullman streamliner railroad business. American countered with their own DC-6. And you can see by 1961, Delta had become a force not only in the United States, but also went as far as Caracas and San Juan. So they were becoming a big player. So they got the last of this was the biggest propeller airplane, the DC-7, the Crown DC-7. That one on the Miami route. That was always a prestigious route for Delta. American countered with their own DC-7s. You can now fly non-stop from Cincinnati to LA on occasion, although most of the schedules I see show a stop in Dallas-Fort Worth. There's and this is the days before TSA and anything. You could get right out on take any picture you wanted, basically. Matter of fact, one day my friend Bill Myers is a young man. Bill retired, you may remember him as a weatherman for WLW and announcer for many years. They let him get in a Convair 340 and sit down and take pictures of the airport. This is about 1960. He was also the disc jockey for a Music Till Dawn show on WLW. Some of you about that time, you probably remember some of that music. I think it was from 12 at night to 6 a.m., sponsored by American Airlines. And so, of course, he had a little more access. I incidentally worked for a short time for WNOP, Radio Free Newport, 740 on your dial. I had a Friday afternoon, what's happening at the local high schools shot, and then played a few records. Nice night shot of the airport. Piedmont in the background, beautiful shot. Now this is a good shot, heading for LaGuardia once, turned around and got the administration building, and that's probably every airplane that was parked at that time, all 7 of them. American was here, TWA was always here, and Delta and Lake Central were somewhere over in there, and that was it. About it. In 1960, Delta introduced jet service to Miami from Cincinnati. And of course, the Green Line was the Dixie Airport Urban Bus was still the exclusive provider of transportation to and from the hotels. So they, of course, they got one of their new buses in the mix here. Then we got a, yeah, there's a better picture of the Dixie Airport. By now they were air-conditioned, large buses, nice buses, the road wall. There's another shot of a Delta airplane, Convair 880. American didn't quite get to the jet age right away. They went through what is known as a turboprop, which was a half propeller, half turbine airplane called a turboprop. This was the Lockheed Electra. And they introduced this. I worked at the airport in 1961 for American Airlines in the summer when they still had summer help. And I worked at the podium and did a lot of odd jobs. I was basically a gopher. But one day, I was all there at the podium at American Airlines alone. And the schedule, now you've got to remember in the background, the schedule says this airplane, this Lockheed Electra, left Cincinnati at 9 a.m. and got into Chicago at 8:59 a.m. Well, of course, you know, there's time zone difference there, but we always quoted in local time. He had a good old boy from somewhere down, probably Pendleton County, probably one of my relatives, bib overalls and everything. He looked at that, he said, "Sir," he says, "is that right? Am I reading that right? This plane leaves at 9 a.m. in Cincinnati and it gets in Chicago at 8:59? I said, "Yes, sir, that's right." And I said, "Would you like to buy a ticket?" He hesitated a while and said, "No," but he said, "I would like to know the best place to stand because I want to see that son of a gun take off." He didn't use gun, but I cleaned it up for the audience. But American did get to jet service and right after Delta. That's a Boeing 707. That also became a very popular airplane. Most every airline in the world flew a Boeing 707. And they had a smaller brother, the Boeing 720. Just a little smaller. And they also bought some Convair 990s, which was the fastest airplane on the planet at the time. It had a cruising speed of over 600 miles an hour. The only problem was it burned JP4 fuel at an enormous rate. And as soon as that first oil recession, the oil shortages, 73, you remember OPEC business? Stand in line, you know, and yeah, these things were parked right away. They didn't last very long. But they were having problems eventually with capacity. So American came up with an idea to have have a cockpit on each end, so they could always park them a little easier. Now I happened to be standing out there by the, I don't know if it was called the Island Queen at that point or not, but that's the restaurant. I'm sure a lot of us had at least one date with someone at that, because at that time it was one of the nicer restaurants. And it was a great place to watch planes too. Since I was a transportation enthusiast, if the date didn't work out, I still had planes to watch, so I was happy, one way or the other. TWA, of course, joined the crowd with jets. Then Eastern came in the late 60s, Eastern Airlines. Piedmont upgraded to something called a turboprop YS-11. This plane was actually made in Japan. The only airplane that any American Airlines flew that was made in Japan. They also flew the Fairchild F-27, which was a turboprop. Transworld got fancier in the late 60s, and they also instituted nonstop service from Cincinnati to Los Angeles. A few shots of American Airlines back in the days when you trotted out, no jet bridges, You trot out through all sorts of weather, went up the stairs, and there you go. And they were servicing the airplane on the other side, and you could, you stand 40 feet away and take these nice pictures. This was the airplane that actually became the moneymaker of all time, probably the Boeing 727, this tri-jet. And for a while, when you didn't have land bridges, not only could you could come downstairs, but they had built-in stairs that dropped out the back of the airplane, and you could also, the people in the back could step right down and there. Of course, they turned the engines off. You wouldn't want to drop down there and gotten sucked in one of those JT-8s, but that might have made a bad day for you. But you remember this Cooper guy that hijacked the airplane? Well, he knew about this, and he made them open the back stairs, and that's when he did his parachuting out with all the money. And then the FAA barred any further use of those back stairs. And American also had some of these DAC 111s. They were made in Britain. And this was the only British airliner that actually was used in any great numbers. This was a shorter hop airplane. I used to fly this up to Cleveland and Buffalo occasionally. We're going to see this airplane again, incidentally. It was a good plane apparently for the used market. Hey, how we're getting down to the last days in 1965 of propeller service. And the American last day was fittingly December 17th, 1965. The Wright brothers, on the Wright brothers anniversary. And all the last planes that day that had range, they all flew around the Memorial Kitty Hawk before they went to their respective destinations. TWA, this is a Constellation, that triple-tailed propeller airplane. It actually lasted in service until 1967, Cincinnati to Philadelphia. I put my mother-in-law and father-in-law on this flight, not knowing that it would be gone within 3 weeks, and they were making history. North Central came to a greater Cincinnati airport in the mid-60s. They later merged, everybody merged, but they later merged with some other airlines and became Republic. And Republic begat somebody who begat U.S. Airways, who, kind of United came, and they flew a French airplane, one of the few American airlines to fly. This is called a Caravelle. Nice shot. And then Allegheny arrived in the early 70s. This is not shot at Greater Cincinnati, but sometimes you had to shoot them where you could. But when you could still walk out on all these runways, I could stay there for at least a few seconds. And you got to give me credit for this one because it was raining. I remember that. There's a 727 back at CVG. And Delta also had some long-range DC-8s, which they serviced the Cincinnati market. They used to have, I remember when the kids were little, they used to have night coaches, which were cheaper. And if you got there like 2 in the morning, to go to Florida with the kids, it was like half off. And so they used these a lot on the night coaches. They just packed everybody in there and off you went. But Dixie Traction, subsidiary of the Green Line, still running airport buses into the 1970s, including this deck-and-a-halfer here. And they ran nice buses in the hotels. In the middle 70s, CVG started on its first round of expansion, major expansion. Terminal 1, Terminal 2, going over to Terminal 3. And that was completed in 1975. And they say, well, we'll never need any more room than that. Well, as it turned out, Delta ended up making Cincinnati a hub for a while. It's hard to believe. I just looked at the stats today. In 1996, CVG handled almost 25 million passengers. Last year, they handled a little over 6 million passengers. So you can see the fall off in just that length of time. It had some effect on our economy here in northern Kentucky. Thank the Lord for DHL. The airport was very nice. In the 70s, the airport board was very progressive, very accommodating, and they saved all the murals from the Cincinnati Union Terminal and put them in various places around the airport. That was for the Lunken company that made airplanes first at Lunken and then in Middletown, a local industry. And also, of course, they had a mural of WLW, which at one time was the nation's station. 500,000 watts. The problem was that people were hearing with the transmitter up near Mason, Ohio, for about 10 miles around, people were hearing WLW in their cars without having to turn on the radio. The metal was actually, you know, and people with a lot of fillings, they could listen to the ball game by opening their mouth, even if they didn't have a radio. So they eventually cut them down to 50,000 watts. But they developed a lot of talent here in Cincinnati. Andy Williams, the McGuire sisters come to mind, and there are others. But
Rosemary Clooney.
oh yeah, sorry Nick. Yeah, Rosemary Clooney, and she had a sister who was also a singer, and I forgot her name already.
Betty.
Thank you.
Betty Clooney.
As the Beatles say, you can get by with a little help from your friends. This is by the late 80s. The airport was going in all 3 terminals very, very well. And in a year or two, the first of these cross fingers out here would be built for Delta. They would build a second one out here. And then there was at that time, a regional airline named Comair, and they built yet another concourse way out there, which is now going to be torn down. And all this has been torn down, and you're down to this and this and this now, basically. The first wide-body jet was actually a TWA jet in 1977. This is a Lockheed 1011 that went from Cincinnati to LA. Piedmont finally got jets, thank goodness. But this is a nice airline. I thought I had to do a lot of flying over the years. You remember that American Airlines BAC 111? It came back in the late 80s as Braniff Airlines. They used aircraft that was on the air, and we took that as a cut rate in 1988. It was a experience. It was leaking water. They obviously had a new flight attendant. We had some bumpy weather going into either Orlando or Fort Lauderdale, I can't remember. And we're sitting in the back, and the flight attendant has her head covered. She says, "Have we landed yet?" So I don't think she was destined to stay with the airline industry. We've also had several visits from the presidents of the United States at various times. This is George Herbert Walker Bush's visit in 1991. At the time, being a federal prosecutor and having, when the Secret Service not guarding the president, they also are the chief people that investigate counterfeiting and crimes like that against the United States. The Treasury Department, since they were technically members of the Treasury Department. So I knew all these guys, and they said, "Well, I'll tell you what, if you and your wife come over, after George gets in his motorcade, we'll take you up and let you look at Air Force One." So that's a deal. So, see, if I hadn't handled their cases properly, I wouldn't have gotten within 500 feet of this airplane. They would not let you take pictures of the inside, though. Under any circumstance. Okay, here we see the first of the, what I call the wings built onto Terminal C, once Terminal 3, then Terminal C, and then Concourse A, B, and C. They kept changing their numerology around. Delta was very active We got a new control tower, and occasionally, various jet engines and parts would come in on one of these guppies, that old Stratoliner from the 40s that they had put the new body on, and it was quite slow and cumbersome, but it could carry oversized loads. I've always thought that was neat. And you all do remember the late departed Comair. We went from 2 planes to 180 planes, back to no planes, within a course of about 20 years. But this is some of their earlier planes, what I call the pencil planes, the Swearingen Metros, these things in front here. I took one of those babies to Nashville once. I was in the front, I had a colleague in the back, and we were talking. It was bad weather. And I'd be talking to him over this shoulder for a while, and then the tail would swing around, and I'd be talking to him over this shoulder for a while. Those were miserable riding airplanes. Delta, of course, was our main carrier, still is. But they had a lot of wide body service at one time. They were so busy, they had their own control tower to control just the ramp operations. After the controllers out at the main tower ended them off. They even bought Delta, the employees bought Delta an airplane, a 767. So that was a lot of money. I can get you a used one now for probably 55, 60 million if you need one. But Delta, we got our first international flights with Delta, first to London. And here's the airport, it was decorated up to look like the tower in London Bridge. Then they had in '89 Germany. Went to Frankfurt from here nonstop. There we go. Sort of fit in with Oktoberfest that year. Then to Paris nonstop in 1990. And they even had a small Arc de Triomphe in the waiting area over at the airport. Pretty cool. And for a while, not only Delta, but there was a second flight that Air France ran into here in the 90s and early 2000s. Sabine also came in briefly to Brussels. I mean, there was all sorts of, now you got that one flight a day to Paris and that's it. Zurich too. For about 4 years, Delta did a Zurich flight. That's why all those flags are up there, just to represent the various countries flown at the time. It was pretty cool. There's the airport at about its prime in the late 90s. I think this is the garage that just opened, and that turned out to be my best vantage point with the semi-telephoto, because they were getting pretty nasty about taking slides in certain areas. Thinking about, okay, now the airport left in 1975, finally. The Green Line even ran that, the parent company of the Green Line ran that for a couple more years after the Green Line became Tank in general. And then airport service stopped in about 1975. In the late 90s, of course, the 2X airport bus from downtown Cincinnati and Covington, primarily designed to carry workers to and from the airport, especially when we had 24 million people a year for a while there for about a 10-year period. This is their latest bus. These are nice. It's got the hi-fi, wireless hi-fi, the whole thing. It's very nice, and they run them on the 2X. They also run them on the Hebron and the Walton runs occasionally, I note. And we're getting about there at 8 o'clock. Also, in the last few years, and I remarked to some people before we started how Northern Kentucky has become very historically conscious. You know, you've got these wonderful historical societies. We've had the Northern Kentucky Encyclopedia, a couple of books even published by the Earl Engel Centennial people, A lot of books and stuff over there on the table. See, I mentioned them again, and she'll be more than happy to sell them to you. But anyhow, we also have commemorated, unfortunately, and I do want to say, incidentally, before I do this, that actually airline travel is about 38 times safer than automobile. You've got 38, if you would go from here to Chicago, for instance, you've got a 38 times chance of getting killed in your automobile as to taking an airliner. As a matter of fact, it's become the second safest form of transportation in the world, right after the Japanese bullet train. But in 1955, TWA collided with a Castleton Farms plane right outside the airport here, and fortunately, I guess there weren't a lot of people on board. I think only 14 passengers and crew. And that was the worst disaster until this. This is American Airlines flight 383 in November of 1965. It was going on to LaGuardia. I was coming from LaGuardia on approach to Cincinnati. And it crashed in the woods. As it turned out later, they found out the altimeters were of a dial type situation and they were hard to read. There was nothing like a digital readout or anything, or even like a speedometer, odometer count. It was an actual clock face type of thing. And they misinterpreted 1,100 feet for 100 feet. And almost everybody died. There were a few survivors. And then, unfortunately, within 2 years, almost the identical thing happened with the TWA flight. But in the since then, it's been very safe here. Now, we did have one other incident, of course. You may remember the Air Canada Flight 797 that had a fire on board and landed at Cincinnati Airport, and there was some loss of life in that particular situation too.
They burnt up. Those people burnt up. It wasn't actually a crash.
That's correct. They landed safely, per se, but before they could stop and get everything deployed, the fire had spread throughout most of the cabin. All apparently started by someone smoking a cigarette in the lavatory. But I'm not sure that they ever actually got to the root cause of that particular problem. Anyhow, so our first responders had unfortunately a bad few years in there. Unfortunately, they have not had that problem again. This was the last American Airlines flight out of Cincinnati. I just happened, propeller plane out of Cincinnati in 1965, and not I, but Bill Myers happened to be at the airport and got that baby as it took off in the twilight. I also think that's a good memorial shot for the people that died in those crashes, and we hope that within a few seconds they were all able to reach up and touch the face of God. That's it.